The desert wind carried the acrid smell of gasoline and smoke across the peaceful suburban street as three black SUVs crept toward Miguel Rodriguez's modest farmhouse. In the lead vehicle, the cartel soldiers snickered among themselves, seeing nothing but an easy target, a quiet old man tending his small farm at the edge of a sleepy Arizona neighborhood. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But they were about to make the mistake of their lives. They had no idea that the unassuming farmer they were about to threaten was a former Delta Force operative, a man who had spent decades hunting down the world's most dangerous terrorists in the shadows. The setting sun cast long shadows across Miguel's neatly tended vegetable gardens as he watched the approaching vehicles through his kitchen window. His weathered hands, calloused from years of farm work that had helped him find peace after his military service, clenched involuntarily. The tranquil life he had built here, the quiet existence that helped keep his demons at bay, was about to be shattered. Diego Ramirez, the local cartel lieutenant, had been eyeing this neighborhood for months. The quiet streets, the mix of suburban homes and small farms made it perfect for their operation. One by one, they had been forcing out local residents, turning properties into storage points for their smuggling routes. Most people had crumbled under their threats, selling their homes for pennies on the dollar. But this old farmer, this Miguel Rodriguez, had refused every offer. "Remember," Diego barked at his men as they pulled up to the property, "make it quick, make it messy, break him." His men nodded, grinning as they checked their weapons. They had done this dozens of times before: show up in force, rough up. Any resistance, torch a few buildings. Fear was their currency, and business was good. Miguel moved silently through his house, his bare feet making no sound on the wooden floors. 20 years of combat experience flooded back as his mind shifted into operational mode. He had chosen this property carefully when he retired. Clear lines of sight, multiple exit points, reinforced walls that looked normal from the outside. The cartel thought they were dealing with a stubborn old farmer. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The first group of cartel soldiers approached Miguel's front porch, their boots heavy on the wooden steps. One of them carried a gas can, sloshing it carelessly. Another held a baseball bat, tapping it against his leg as he walked. They were sloppy, overconfident, unused to anyone fighting back in this quiet neighborhood. Miguel's pulse remained steady. As he watched them through the security cameras he'd discreetly installed around the property. 8 men total, armed with a mix of pistols and submachine guns. Amateur work. They weren't even maintaining proper coverage of their blind spots. In his earpiece, he could hear the feed from the directional microphones picking up their conversations. "Check the back," Diego ordered from his position by the SUVs. "Make sure the old man doesn't try to run." 2 men peeled off, heading around the side of the house. Miguel allowed himself a grim smile. They were splitting up just as he had hoped. He reached into a hidden panel in his kitchen wall, retrieving the first of several weapons he had stashed throughout the house. The cartel soldiers reached his door, not even bothering to check for security systems or cameras. One of them pounded on the door with his fist. "Rodriguez," he shouted, "open up, old man. We need to talk about your property." Miguel took a slow, deliberate breath. In his mind, he could hear his old commanding officer's voice from his Delta Force days. "The amateur is proud of how many fights he's won. The professional is proud of how many fights he's avoided. But when a fight is unavoidable, end it decisively." The pounding on the door grew louder. Through his cameras, Miguel watched the 2 men at the back of his house checking his tool shed. They were about to discover the first of several surprises he had prepared when he'd seen the cartel moving into the neighborhood months ago. The quiet suburban street was about to become a battlefield, and Miguel felt a familiar calm settle over him. He had tried to live peacefully, tried to leave the violence behind. But some men only understand one language, and Miguel was fluent in it. The cartel had picked the wrong farmer to intimidate. They had no idea they were walking into the carefully prepared kill zone of a man who had spent his entire adult life perfecting the art of close-quarters combat. As Miguel moved into position, he said a quiet prayer, not for himself, but for the men outside who had made the last mistake of their lives. The first explosion rocked the quiet neighborhood as the two cartel soldiers breached Miguel's tool shed. The blast wasn't designed to kill, just disorient and create chaos. Miguel watched through his cameras as the men stumbled backward, ears ringing, covered in the pink powder he had rigged to explode with the door. Now they were marked, their black clothes stained with fluorescent pigment that would make them easy to track in the growing darkness. "What the hell was that?" Diego shouted from the front of the house. The men at Miguel's door stopped their pounding, hands moving to their weapons as they spun toward the sound of the explosion. Their disciplined facade was already cracking, replaced by uncertainty. This wasn't how these operations usually went. Miguel moved silently through his house, keeping to the reinforced walls he had installed during his renovations. The cartel soldiers were now exactly where he wanted them, scattered, confused, and starting to realize this wasn't going to be a simple intimidation job. Through his earpiece, he could hear their increasingly panicked radio chatter. "Someone's rigged the place," one of the powder-covered men shouted into his radio. "This crazy old man's got the whole property wired." There was fear in his voice now, the cocky confidence of earlier replaced by growing dread. They had expected a helpless farmer, not prepared defenses. Diego's voice crackled over their radios, trying to regain control of the situation. "Breach the house! Now! Find him!" But his men hesitated, eyeing the seemingly innocent farmhouse with new respect. The simple wooden structure now looked ominous in the fading daylight, its windows dark and uninviting. Miguel allowed himself a small smile as he moved to his predetermined position. In his Delta Force days, they had a saying, "The deadliest weapon is the one between your ears." These cartel soldiers were used to bullying civilians, not facing an opponent who had spent years planning for exactly this scenario. The men at the front door finally worked up their courage, one of them stepping back to kick the door in. The wood splintered, but the door didn't fall. Instead, the reinforced frame absorbed the impact, sending painful vibrations up the man's leg. As he stumbled backward, cursing, Miguel made his move. A flashbang grenade dropped from a concealed compartment in the porch roof, detonating before any of the cartel soldiers could react. In the chaos that followed, Miguel emerged from a side door, moving like a shadow in the smoke. The first soldier never saw what hit him. A precise strike to the throat dropped him silently to the ground. The second man managed to raise his weapon, but Miguel was already inside his guard. Years of close-quarters combat training took over as Miguel grabbed the gun, using the man's own momentum to slam him into the porch railing. The crack of breaking ribs was lost in the general confusion. From his position by the SUVs, Diego was shouting orders, trying to coordinate his remaining men. But the carefully orchestrated attack had devolved into chaos. The two powder-marked men from the shed were firing blindly at shadows, their eyes still adjusting from the explosion. Another soldier was stumbling around the side of the house, blood streaming from his ears after the flashbang. Miguel disappeared back into his house as quickly as he had emerged, leaving 3 men down and the others shooting at ghosts. He moved through the familiar corridors, his bare feet silent on the floors. The house he had spent years preparing was more than just a home. It was a fortress, designed to his exact specifications. Through his security feeds, he watched the remaining cartel soldiers regrouping, their movements becoming more cautious. They were professionals, or at least they thought they were, and they were adjusting their tactics. But Miguel had planned for this too. He reached up, flipping a hidden switch. and the exterior lights he had installed around his property suddenly blazed to life. The powerful LEDs cast harsh shadows across the yard, destroying the cartel soldiers' night vision and creating disorienting patterns of light and dark. In their confusion, none of them noticed the slight hiss of gas being released from concealed pipes near the ground, a non-lethal but highly effective mixture that would soon make their eyes water and their coordination suffer. Miguel checked his watch. Less than 2 minutes had passed since the first explosion, and already half of Diego's men were down. But the real fight was just beginning. The cartel lieutenant wasn't going to retreat, not with his reputation at stake. This quiet neighborhood was about to learn why Miguel had chosen such a remote property, why he had insisted on living at the edge of the development. Some fights couldn't be avoided, but they could be prepared for. And Miguel had been preparing for this one since the day he'd watched the first black SUV cruise slowly past his house, marking his property as their next target. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The cartel was about to learn a harsh lesson about judging books by their covers, about assuming that a quiet farmer living alone was an easy target. Diego crouched behind his SUV, trying to make sense of the chaos unfolding around his position. What should have been a routine intimidation job had turned into a nightmare. 3 of his men were down, 2 more were compromised by whatever had exploded in that shed, and the rest were scattered around the property, jumping at shadows. The quiet suburban street had become a war zone, and for the first time in years, Diego felt real fear creeping up his spine. Inside the house, Miguel moved with practiced efficiency, checking his security feeds one last time before moving to the next phase of his plan. The cartel soldiers' confusion was evident in their erratic movements, their coordinated attack dissolving into individual survival instincts. Through his earpiece, he could hear their increasingly desperate radio communications. "Where is he?" one of them shouted, his voice cracking. "How is he doing this?" Another voice cut in, thick with panic. "This isn't right, man. This isn't some regular farmer. We need to pull back." But Diego's response was immediate and harsh. "Nobody leaves. Find him and finish this, or I'll finish you myself." Miguel allowed himself a grim smile as he moved to one of the hidden gun ports he had installed in his walls. The cartel lieutenant was making a classic mistake, letting pride override tactical necessity. In his years with Delta Force, Miguel had seen the same error countless times. Ego was often the deadliest enemy. The gas he had released was beginning to take effect. Through his thermal cameras, Miguel could see the remaining soldiers struggling to maintain their positions, their movements becoming uncoordinated as the irritants affected their eyes and breathing. It wasn't deadly. Miguel had chosen his countermeasures carefully, wanting to incapacitate rather than kill when possible. Dead men couldn't carry warnings back to their masters. One of the powder-marked soldiers stumbled too close to another. Hidden sensor, triggering a sequence of small explosions in the garden. The blasts were mostly noise and light, designed to disorient rather than harm, but they had the desired effect. The man panicked, firing wildly into the darkness, his shots going wide and high. "Cease fire!" Diego screamed into his radio, but it was too late. The random shooting had done exactly what Miguel wanted, drawn attention from the neighbors. In the distance, sirens began to wail. The clock was now ticking for the cartel crew, their window of opportunity shrinking with every passing second. Miguel keyed a sequence into a hidden panel, and sections of his garden suddenly burst into flames. The carefully placed accelerants created a wall of fire between the cartel soldiers and their vehicles, cutting off their escape route. The heat and smoke added to their confusion, the carefully orchestrated chaos pushing them toward the only a clear path, directly into Miguel's kill zone. Through his thermal scope, Miguel watched as two more soldiers tried to flank his position, moving through what they thought was a blind spot in his defenses. They didn't realize they were walking right into another trap. With practiced precision, Miguel triggered another series of defenses, sprinklers that sprayed not water, but a mixture of oil and other substances that made the ground treacherously slick. The men went down hard, their weapons skittering away across the slippery ground. Before they could recover, Miguel was moving again, silent as a ghost despite his age. Years of farming hadn't dulled his combat skills. If anything, the physical labor had kept him stronger than most men half his age. From his position behind the SUV, Diego was coming to a horrible realization. This wasn't just a prepared position. This was a masterwork of defensive planning. Every move his men made seemed to trigger another trap. Every attempt to gain an advantage turned against them. The quiet farmer they had come to intimidate had turned his modest property into a fortress, and they were caught in the middle of it. "Pull back," Diego finally ordered, his voice hoarse with fear and smoke. "Everyone, fall back to the vehicles." But retreat wasn't as simple as giving the order. The wall of fire had grown, cutting off direct access to their SUVs. The gas in the air was making it hard to think, hard to coordinate, and somewhere in the chaos, the old farmer was watching, waiting, directing this symphony of destruction. With terrifying precision, Miguel watched through his cameras as the cartel soldiers tried to regroup. Their professional demeanor had completely crumbled, replaced by pure survival instinct. This was the moment he had been waiting for, when the fear overwhelmed their training, when they forgot everything except the desire to escape. The sirens were getting closer now, their wail cutting through the sound of crackling flames and sporadic gunfire. Miguel knew he had to end this quickly. The local police weren't equipped to handle a cartel hit squad, and he had no intention of explaining his elaborate defensive preparations to law enforcement. It was time for the final act of this carefully choreographed performance. The cartel had come expecting to find an easy target, a simple farmer they could bully and intimidate. Instead, they had walked into the domain of a man who had spent his entire military career planning for worst-case scenarios, a man who had turned his quiet retirement into a preparation for exactly this kind of confrontation. And now, as Miguel moved into position for his final assault, he knew the real message was about to be delivered. Miguel emerged from his hidden position like a ghost from the smoke, his movements smooth and deliberate despite his age. The years of maintaining his farm had kept his muscles strong, his reflexes sharp. He had chosen his moment perfectly. The cartel soldiers were scattered, disoriented, and cut off from their leader. Through the chaos of flames and smoke, he moved with deadly purpose. Diego, still crouched behind his SUV, was frantically trying to raise his men on the radio. The organized hit squad he had brought to this quiet suburban street had been reduced to a collection of panicked individuals, each fighting their own private battle against an enemy they couldn't see. The acrid smoke from Miguel's defensive fires filled the air, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. "Where are you?" Diego screamed into his radio, his composed facade cracking. "Someone report! Anyone!" But the only responses were scattered bursts of static and the occasional sound of coughing. The irritant gas Miguel had released was doing its work, making it nearly impossible for the cartel soldiers to coordinate their actions. Miguel approached the first of his remaining targets, one of the powder-marked men from the tool shed explosion. The soldier was trying to clear his eyes, his weapon held loosely in one hand. He never saw Miguel coming. A quick strike to the back of the neck, and another cartel member went down silently. Miguel caught him before he could fall, laying him quietly on the ground. Even now, he moved with the precision of a trained operative. Through his earpiece, Miguel could hear the police sirens getting closer. He needed to end this quickly. The local authorities weren't prepared for this level of violence, and he had no intention of letting innocent officers walk into a firefight. His hand went to the detonator in his pocket, one last surprise for the remaining cartel members. 2 more soldiers had managed to regroup near the burning garden, their backs pressed against what they thought was the safety of a concrete planter. They didn't realize that Miguel had prepared this position too. With a click of the detonator, small charges buried in the planter went off, not enough to kill, but the concussive force knocked both men unconscious instantly. Diego heard the explosion and saw 2 more of his men go down. The reality of the situation finally hit him. This wasn't just a prepared defense. This was a masterpiece of tactical planning. Every move they made seemed to play into the old farmer's hands. Every attempt to gain control only revealed new layers of his preparation. "Who are you?" Diego whispered, more to himself than anyone else. The quiet farmer they had come to intimidate had transformed into something else entirely, a shadow that moved through smoke and flame with terrifying efficiency. In all his years with the cartel, Diego had never encountered anything like this. Miguel was closing in on Diego's position, now moving from cover to cover with the patience of a man who had spent decades in combat zones. He could see the cartel lieutenant's growing panic, could sense the moment approaching when fear would override training. That was what he had been waiting for. Through the smoke, Diego caught a glimpse of movement. He raised his weapon, firing blindly at the shadow. But Miguel wasn't there. He had already moved, using the sound of gunfire to mask his true position. The cartel lieutenant was running out of ammunition, out of men, and out of time. "It's over, Diego." Miguel's voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, carried by the smoke and echoing off the burning buildings. "You made a mistake coming here. You made a bigger mistake threatening my home." Diego spun around, trying to locate the source of the voice. "What are you?" he shouted, his weapon trembling in his hands. "What kind of farmer are you?" "The kind who spent 20 years hunting men like you," Miguel replied, his voice calm and steady. "The kind who chose this quiet neighborhood specifically because it was perfect for defense. The kind who knew someday someone like you would come." The sirens were very close now, their wailing cutting through the sound of crackling flames. Diego made his final mistake. He turned to look toward the sound just for a moment. That was all Miguel needed. He emerged from the smoke behind Diego, as silent as death itself. The cartel lieutenant sensed the presence behind him and tried to turn, but it was too late. Miguel's strike was precise, targeted, and devastatingly effective. Diego crumpled to the ground, his weapon clattering away across the pavement. The last thing he saw before consciousness fled was the face of the farmer he had come to intimidate. Not the face of a simple agriculturist, but the hard, weathered features of a man who had spent his life in the shadows of war. As police cars began to appear at the end of the street, Miguel moved quickly. He had prepared for this too, hidden paths through the neighborhood that would let him disappear until the immediate crisis had passed. The authorities would find an elaborate scene, unconscious cartel soldiers, burning gardens, and evidence of a defensive action that would raise many questions. But they wouldn't find Miguel. Like the Delta Force operative he had once been, he would vanish into the background, becoming once again just another quiet farmer in a peaceful neighborhood. The cartel had learned their lesson today. Sometimes the quietest targets were the deadliest, and some farmers grew more than just crops in their gardens. The first police cruisers rolled onto the scene, their lights cutting through the smoke that still hung heavy in the air. Officers emerged with weapons drawn, trying to make sense of the chaos before them. The peaceful suburban street had been transformed into something that looked more like a war zone. Burning gardens, unconscious. Men scattered across the property, and the acrid smell of smoke and chemical irritants filling the air. Miguel watched from his carefully prepared observation point 2 blocks away, using high-powered optics to monitor the situation. He had escaped through a series of underground passages, old storm drains he had modified over the years for exactly this purpose. The same passages would allow him to return home once the immediate crisis had passed. For now, he needed to ensure that everything played out according to plan. The police were discovering Diego and his men, all unconscious but alive. Miguel had been precise in his attacks, careful not to use lethal force unless absolutely necessary. Dead cartel soldiers would bring too much attention, too many questions, but living ones would carry a message back to their masters. A message about the true cost of threatening the wrong farmer. Through his earpiece, connected to the surveillance systems he had left running, Miguel could hear the police radio chatter. They were calling for backup, for emergency services, for investigators. They had found the weapons dropped by the cartel. Soldiers, the evidence of what had been intended as a simple intimidation job, turned deadly serious. "What the hell happened here?" one officer asked, his voice carrying clearly through Miguel's directional microphones. The senior officer on scene shook his head, walking carefully through the aftermath of the battle. "Whatever it was, this wasn't random. Look at the preparation, the planning. Someone was ready for this." Miguel allowed himself a small smile. They had no idea just how right they were. Every aspect of the defense had been meticulously planned, from the non-lethal gas compounds to the carefully placed charges. His years of Delta Force experience had taught him the value of precise, measured response. Tonight had been about sending a message, not creating martyrs. In the distance, Miguel could see more emergency vehicles arriving, fire trucks to deal with the still-burning gardens, ambulances for the unconscious cartel soldiers. Soon there would be detectives, forensics teams, people asking questions about what had happened in this quiet suburban neighborhood. But they wouldn't find much. The defensive systems were designed to be virtually undetectable once disabled. The hidden passages would remain hidden, and Miguel's security cameras had already begun automatically erasing their footage, leaving no electronic trail of the night's events. Through his scope, Miguel watched as Diego was loaded into an ambulance, still unconscious. The cartel lieutenant would wake up with a headache and a story he would hardly believe himself. His men would recover too, each with their own confused memories of a simple intimidation job that had gone horrifically wrong. Miguel's phone vibrated, a secure message from one of his old Delta Force contacts. "Chatter suggests cartel leadership is already asking questions. Your message was received." Miguel typed a brief acknowledgement. He had known word would spread fast in certain circles. The cartel would soon learn that this quiet neighborhood was off limits, protected by something far more dangerous than local law enforcement. As the scene below continued to unfold, Miguel began his careful withdrawal. He had other observation posts to check, other security measures to reset. The underground passages would take him back to his property through a route that emerged in his basement, a route that would be impossible for investigators to discover without knowing exactly where to look. The night's events would raise questions, but Miguel had prepared for that too. His cover as a simple farmer was carefully crafted, backed by years of actual agricultural work. His neighbors knew him as the quiet man who grew exceptional vegetables and kept to himself. Nothing in his public persona suggested anything more dangerous than a green thumb. The cartel had made a fundamental mistake tonight. They had seen his modest house, his small farm, his quiet demeanor, and assumed he was an easy target. They hadn't bothered to dig deeper, to question why a single farmer would choose to live at the edge of a development, or why his property had such extensive security measures hidden beneath its peaceful exterior. Miguel's years in Delta Force had taught him the value of being underestimated. Tonight, that lesson had been passed on to Diego and his men. They had come expecting to find a vulnerable old man, someone they could bully and intimidate. Instead, They had walked into the carefully prepared kill zone of a man who had spent his entire military career planning for worst-case scenarios. As Miguel made his way through the underground passages, his mind was already working on the next phase. The cartel would be back, perhaps not tomorrow or next week, but eventually. Pride would demand it. But when they came, they would find him ready. The quiet farmer would be waiting in his garden, among his vegetables and his hidden defenses, prepared to teach them another lesson about judging books by their covers. The sirens continued to wail in the distance, but Miguel paid. He had them no mind. He had a garden to tend, vegetables to care for, and defensive preparations to reset. After all, he was just a simple farmer, one who happened to grow more than just crops in his carefully tended soil. The following morning dawned quiet and hazy, the lingering smoke from the previous night's chaos drifting through the suburban streets. Miguel was already in his garden, methodically checking his plants and repairing the damage from the confrontation. To any observer, he looked like nothing more than a dedicated farmer tending to his crops after a difficult night. But his eyes never stopped scanning the surroundings, his ears attuned to every sound. Police tape still cordoned off sections of his property where the most visible fighting had occurred. Investigators moved back and forth, documenting evidence and taking photographs. Miguel paid them little attention. He knew they wouldn't find anything that could tie the sophisticated defenses back to him. Years of covert operations had taught him how to leave a clean scene. Detective Sarah Martinez stood at the edge of Miguel's property, watching the old farmer work. Something about this scene didn't add up. The reports from last night painted a picture that defied easy explanation. Multiple armed suspects, all professionally trained, taken down with military imprecision. Yet here was Miguel Rodriguez, calmly tending his tomatoes as if nothing had happened. "Mr. Rodriguez," she called out, approaching the garden, "we need to ask you a few more questions about last night." Miguel straightened up slowly, playing the part of the aging farmer to perfection. His hands were dirty from the soil, his face weathered from years in the sun. Nothing about him suggested a man capable of defeating a cartel hit squad. "Of course, detective," he replied, his voice carrying just the right mix of confusion and concern. "Though I'm afraid I can't tell you much more than I already have. I was in my basement when all the commotion started. By the time I came up, everything was over." Martinez studied his face carefully. "We found 8 men, Mr. Rodriguez, all unconscious, all carrying professional-grade weapons. This wasn't a random attack." She paused, watching for any reaction. "They were cartel soldiers, and they came here specifically targeting your property." Miguel shrugged, turning back to his tomatoes. "I'm just a farmer, detective. I grow vegetables. I keep to myself. Why would the cartel have any interest in me?" His hands moved surely among the plants, checking for damage, adjusting supports. Each movement was precise, economical, though few would recognize these as the habits of a trained operative. "That's exactly what we're trying to figure out," Martinez replied. "The level of preparation we found here, the defensive positions, the tactical planning, this wasn't the work of an amateur. Someone knew they were coming. Someone was ready for them." Miguel straightened up again, wiping his hands on his worn jeans. "Detective, look around you. What do you see? A small farm? Some vegetables? An old man's retirement project? Whatever happened here last night, it has nothing to do with me. I'm grateful that no one was seriously hurt, but I can't help you understand what I don't understand myself." But Martinez wasn't so easily convinced. She had been working cartel cases for years, had seen the aftermath of their intimidation tactics before. This was different. The cartel soldiers hadn't just been defeated. They had been systematically dismantled by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "We found traces of military-grade irritants in the air," she pressed. "Hidden defensive positions, evidence of sophisticated planning. This isn't the kind of security system a farmer installs to keep out rabbits, Mr. Rodriguez." Miguel smiled, the expression reaching his eyes with practiced ease. "Detective, I'm an old man who grows tomatoes. The most sophisticated thing on my property is my irrigation system. Whatever you think happened here last night, you're looking in the wrong place." Martinez opened her mouth to respond, but her radio crackled to life. "Detective, we need you at the station. The suspects are awake and ready for questioning." She gave Miguel one last long look before turning away. "We'll talk again, Mr. Rodriguez." Miguel watched her leave, his expression unchanged. He had expected this level of scrutiny, had prepared for it. His cover identity was rock solid, backed by years of actual farming experience. Let them investigate. They would find nothing more than an old man who grew exceptional vegetables. As the detective's car pulled away, Miguel returned to his work. The garden needed attention. Real attention, not just the show he had put on. For the investigators, the vegetables he grew weren't just a cover, they had become a genuine passion over the years. There was something satisfying about nurturing life after spending so many years dealing in death. But even as he worked, his mind was processing the implications of last night's attack. The cartel would be regrouping, analyzing their failure, planning their next move. Diego and his men would tell their story, and word would spread through the criminal underworld about the farmer who had systematically dismantled a professional hit squad. Miguel's hands moved surely among his plants, checking damage, adjusting supports. Each movement served a dual purpose, caring for his vegetables while allowing him to scan his surroundings without appearing to do so. The quiet neighborhood was returning to normal, but he knew better than to relax his vigilance. The cartel had made their first move, and the game was far from over. In a dimly lit hospital room across town, Diego Ramirez was regaining consciousness, his head pounding with each heartbeat. The steady beep of medical monitors filled the air as he tried to piece together the fragments of his memory from the previous night. Everything felt like a nightmare. The quiet farm, the traps, the ghost-like farmer who had systematically destroyed his entire team. 2 police officers stood guard outside his room, but Diego's mind wasn't on them. He was thinking about the phone call he would have to make, the explanation he would have to give to his superiors. How could he explain that a simple intimidation job had turned into such a disaster, that an old farmer had outmaneuvered and outfought his entire squad? His phone, carefully hidden in his hospital room by one of his few remaining loyal soldiers, vibrated quietly. Diego knew who it would be even before he looked at the screen. With trembling fingers, he answered the call, his voice hoarse. "Jefe," he managed to say before a cold voice cut him off. 8 men, Diego, 8 of our best soldiers, defeated by one old man." The voice belonged to Carlos Montoya, the regional cartel boss. His tone was calm, measured, which made it all the more terrifying. "You told me this would be simple, that the farmer would break like all the others. Instead, I have 8 men in custody and a police investigation that's drawing unwanted attention to our operations." Diego swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Jefe, there's something about this farmer. He's not what he seems. The way he fought, the way he moved." This was no ordinary man. His entire property was trapped, prepared. He knew we were coming. "Of course he knew." Montoya's voice carried a hint of disgust. "Because you were sloppy. You didn't do your research. Tell me, Diego, did it never occur to you to ask why a single farmer would choose to live at the edge of development? Why he would refuse every offer we made when everyone else sold without a fight?" The questions hit Diego like physical blows. He had been arrogant, overconfident. The old farmer's seemingly vulnerable appearance had blinded him to the obvious signs that something wasn't right. "We'll fix this, Jefe. Give me another chance. I'll bring more men, better weapons. No, Montoya's interruption was sharp, final. You've done enough damage. This situation requires a more professional approach. There was a pause, and Diego felt his blood run cold. He knew what those words meant. I've already made the calls. The cleaners are coming. Diego's heart rate spiked, causing the medical monitors to beep faster. The cleaners! But Jefe, they're... He stopped himself. Everyone in the cartel knew about the cleaners, the elite troubleshooters who were called in when a situation spiraled beyond normal control. They were the best of the best, former Special Forces operators from around the world who had turned their skills to more profitable ventures. They'll be there within 48 hours, Montoya continued, as if Diego hadn't spoken. In the meantime, you will say nothing to the police. You will remember nothing about last night. And Diego? His voice became even colder. If you survive what's coming, we will discuss your future with the organization. The line went dead, leaving Diego alone, with his thoughts and the beeping monitors. Outside his room, life in the hospital continued as normal, but inside he felt like he was suffocating. The cleaners were coming, the cartel's elite kill team. They would eliminate all traces of last night's failure, including any loose ends that might talk to the police. Diego wasn't sure if he was more afraid for himself or for the old farmer. The cleaners weren't like normal cartel soldiers. They wouldn't be fooled by appearances, wouldn't underestimate their target. They would investigate, plan, and then strike with lethal precision. As he lay in his hospital bed, Diego thought about the farmer, about the calm, almost predatory, way he had moved through the chaos of last night's battle. Maybe, he thought, the cleaners were in for a surprise of their own. Maybe the old man was more than even they could handle. But that wasn't his problem anymore. Diego closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing. He had his own survival to worry about now. The cleaners were coming, and with them would come a reckoning that would leave no witnesses and no loose ends. In his mind, he could still see the farmer moving through the smoke and flames, a shadow that struck without warning and vanished just as quickly. For the first time, Diego wondered if they had stumbled onto something much bigger than a simple land grab. The way the farmer had fought, the precision of his attacks. It spoke of years of training, of countless battles fought in shadows. The cleaners were coming, and with them, this quiet suburban neighborhood was about to become a battleground unlike anything Diego had ever seen. As he drifted back into uneasy sleep, his last conscious thought was a question: who would survive? When unstoppable force met immovable object, when the cartel's elite assassins faced off against a farmer who was clearly so much more than he appeared. Back at his farm, Miguel sat in his basement command center, reviewing footage from the previous night's confrontation. The room, hidden behind a false wall and accessible only through a biometric scanner, was a stark contrast to the simple farmhouse above. Multiple screens showed feeds from cameras strategically placed throughout the neighborhood, while sophisticated monitoring equipment tracked police band radio and local communications. A message flashed on one of his secure terminals, a warning from his network of former Delta Force contacts. Cleaners mobilized, ETA 48 hours, full team. Miguel's expression remained neutral, but his mind was already calculating. The cleaners were the cartel's elite kill squad, professional operators with military backgrounds similar to his own. This wouldn't be like dealing with Diego's thugs. Miguel pulled up a series of files on another screen, detailed dossiers on known cartel cleaner teams. His years of maintaining intelligence contacts hadn't been wasted. The faces that scrolled past were a rogues gallery of former Special Forces operators from around the world, men and women who had turned their considerable skills to mercenary work. Time to go to work, Miguel muttered to himself, reaching for a secure phone. He dialed a number from memory, waiting as it rang 3 times before connecting. "It's Rodriguez," he said simply. "I'm calling in marker 7. The voice that responded was gruff, businesslike. "Acknowledged. What do you need?" It belonged to Frank Chen, a former Delta Force teammate who now ran a specialized equipment supply business. "The cleaners are coming," Miguel explained. "I need a resupply. Full package, everything we discussed." There was a pause on the line as Chen processed the implications. The cleaner's reputation was well known in certain circles. "Jesus, Miguel," Chen finally responded. "What did you do to rate their attention?" But he was already typing, the sound of his keyboard carrying over the line. "Never mind, I don't want to know. The package will be there in 24 hours. Standard dead drop?" Miguel confirmed the details and ended the call. He had prepared for this possibility, had contingency plans in place. The cartel wouldn't send the cleaners unless they were serious about eliminating both him and any evidence of their operation. This wasn't about intimidation anymore. It was about total elimination. Moving to another workstation, Miguel began pulling up detailed maps of the neighborhood. The cleaners wouldn't rush in like Diego's team. They would observe, plan, and strike with precision. He needed to expand his defensive preparations beyond his immediate property. His fingers flew over the keyboard as he accessed municipal records, studying utility layouts, drainage systems, and building plans. Every approach route, every potential observation post, every possible angle of attack needed to be accounted for. The quiet suburban streets would become a battlefield, and Miguel intended to use every inch to his advantage. A soft chime indicated another incoming message. This one was from Detective Martinez, requesting another interview. Miguel smiled grimly. The detective was sharp, asking the right questions. Under normal circumstances, he might have been concerned about her investigation. But with the cleaners coming, local law enforcement was the least of his worries. He sent a polite reply declining the interview, citing the stress of recent events. Let her suspicions grow. By the time she pieced together the truth, this would all be over, one way or another. Miguel stood, stretching muscles that still ached from the previous night's exertion. Age was catching up with him, but decades of experience had taught him to work through discomfort. He had 48 hours to prepare for the arrival of the cartel's most lethal operators. Moving to a locked cabinet, he began pulling out equipment that hadn't seen use since his active duty days. Specialized surveillance gear, communication jammers, and weapons that would never be found in a farmer's tool shed. Each piece was meticulously maintained, ready for exactly this type of situation. As he worked, Miguel's mind wandered to his years in Delta Force, to operations in places that didn't officially exist. The cleaners would be similar operators, men and women who understood the shadows they worked in. They wouldn't be fooled by his farmer's disguise. They would see him for what he was. But that was fine. Miguel had chosen this quiet neighborhood, this small farm, for very specific reasons. The layout, the terrain, the clear lines of sight, everything had been selected with defensive operations in mind. He had spent years preparing for a confrontation like this, turning his modest property into a fortress that could withstand professional assault. Above ground, the day continued normally. Neighbors went about their business, children played in nearby yards, and life in the suburban community moved forward unchanged. None of them knew that beneath this peaceful surface, 2 lethal forces were about to collide. Miguel checked his watch. 23 hours until his equipment resupply arrived, 47 hours until the cleaners made their appearance. Time enough to prepare, to turn this quiet neighborhood into a killing ground that would make the previous night's chaos look like a warm-up exercise. The cartel had escalated the situation by calling in their elite operators. Soon they would learn that Miguel Rodriguez, The quiet farmer at the edge of the development had been preparing for exactly this type of escalation since the day he'd chosen this property. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of methodical preparation. Miguel worked tirelessly, expanding his defensive network beyond his immediate property. The equipment from Chen arrived exactly as promised, delivered through a complex series of dead drops that would be impossible to trace. Each piece was state-of-the-art, designed for professional operators who needed absolute reliability. In his basement command center, Miguel studied the thermal imaging feeds from newly placed sensors. The police presence had finally begun to diminish, but he noted 3 unmarked vehicles that had taken up positions around the neighborhood. Surveillance teams, the cleaners' advance scouts, establishing observation posts before the main team arrived. Amateur hour, Miguel muttered to himself, typing commands that activated countermeasures near each vehicle. Hidden speakers began emitting low-frequency sounds just below the threshold of conscious hearing. The desert wind carried the acrid smell of gasoline and smoke across the peaceful suburban street as 3 black SUVs crept toward Miguel Rodriguez's modest farmhouse. In the lead vehicle, the cartel soldiers snickered among themselves, seeing nothing but an easy target, a quiet old man tending his small farm at the edge of a sleepy Arizona neighborhood. But they were about to make the mistake of their lives. They had no idea that the unassuming farmer they were about to threaten was a former Delta Force operative, a man who had spent decades hunting down the world's most dangerous terrorists in the shadows. The setting sun cast long shadows across Miguel's neatly tended vegetable gardens as he watched the approaching vehicles through his kitchen window. His weathered hands, calloused from years of farm work that had helped him find peace after his military service, clenched involuntarily. The tranquil life he had built here, the quiet existence that helped keep his demons at bay, was about to be shattered. Diego Ramirez, the local cartel lieutenant, had been eyeing this neighborhood for months. The quiet streets, the mix of suburban homes and small farms made it perfect for their operation. One by one, they had been forcing out local residents, turning properties into storage points for their smuggling routes. Most people had crumbled under their threats, selling their homes for pennies on the dollar. But this old farmer, this Miguel Rodriguez, had refused every offer. "Remember," Diego barked at his men as they pulled up to the property. "Make it quick, make it messy, break him." His men nodded, grinning as they checked their weapons. They had done this dozens of times before. Show up in force, rough up. Any resistance, torch a few buildings. Fear was their currency and business was good. Miguel moved silently through his house, his bare feet making no sound on the wooden floors. 20 years of combat experience flooded back as his mind shifted into operational mode. He had chosen this property carefully when he retired. Clear lines of sight, multiple exit points, reinforced walls that looked normal from the outside. The cartel thought they were dealing with a stubborn old farmer. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The first group of cartel soldiers approached Miguel's front porch, their boots heavy on the wooden steps. One of them carried a gas can, sloshing it carelessly. Another held a baseball bat, tapping it against his leg as he walked. They were sloppy, overconfident, unused to anyone fighting back in this quiet neighborhood. Miguel's pulse remained steady. As he watched them through the security cameras he had discreetly installed around the property. 8 men total, armed with a mix of pistols and submachine guns. Amateur work. They weren't even maintaining proper coverage of their blind spots. In his earpiece, he could hear the feed from the directional microphones picking up their conversations. "Check the back," Diego ordered from his position by the SUVs. "Make sure the old man doesn't try to run." 2 men peeled off, heading around the side of the house. Miguel allowed himself a grim smile. They were splitting up just as he had hoped. He reached into a hidden panel in his kitchen wall, retrieving the first of several weapons he had stashed throughout the house. The cartel soldiers reached his door, not even bothering to check for security systems or cameras. One of them pounded on the door with his fist. "Rodriguez," he shouted, "open up, old man. We need to talk about your property." Miguel took a slow, deliberate breath. In his mind, he could hear his old commanding officer's voice from his Delta Force days. The amateur is proud of how many fights he's won. The professional is proud of how many fights he's avoided. But when a fight is unavoidable, end it decisively. The pounding on the door grew louder. Through his cameras, Miguel watched the two men at the back of his house checking his tool shed. They were about to discover the first of several surprises he had prepared when he'd seen the cartel moving into the neighborhood months ago. The quiet suburban street was about to become a battlefield, and Miguel felt a familiar calm settle over him. He had tried to live peacefully, tried to leave the violence behind. But some men only understand one language, and Miguel was fluent in it. The cartel had picked the wrong farmer to intimidate. They had no idea they were walking into the carefully prepared kill zone of a man who had spent his entire adult life perfecting the art of close-quarters combat. As Miguel moved into position, he said a quiet prayer, not for himself, but for the men outside who had made the last mistake of their lives. The first explosion rocked the quiet neighborhood as the two cartel soldiers breached Miguel's tool shed. The blast wasn't designed to kill, just disorient and create chaos. Within hours, the surveillance teams would start experiencing headaches, nausea, and disorientation. They wouldn't connect it to their positions, but it would degrade their effectiveness. His phone buzzed. Another message from Detective Martinez. She wasn't giving up, her instincts telling her that something was off about the quiet farmer and his surprising defense against the cartel. Miguel respected her persistence, but he couldn't afford police interference, not with what was coming. Moving to one of his workstations, Miguel pulled up detailed files on known cleaner operations. Their tactics were distinctive, thorough reconnaissance followed by swift, overwhelming force. They preferred to strike at night, using coordinated teams to hit multiple points simultaneously. Their objective would be complete elimination of both target and evidence. Miguel's preparations reflected his understanding of their methodology. He had rigged key approaches with advanced sensors, capable of detecting everything from thermal signatures to slight changes in air pressure. The drainage system around his property now contained an array of surprises, from simple flashbang devices to more sophisticated countermeasures. A soft chime from his security system alerted him to movement at his front door. The camera showed Detective Martinez, alone this time, knocking persistently. Miguel watched her through multiple angles, noting her stance, the way her eyes scanned the property. She was good, professional, but she was also a potential complication. He activated the exterior speaker. "Detective Martinez," he called out, his voice carrying the slight tremor of an old man. "I'm not feeling up to visitors today. The events of the other night have left me quite shaken." Through his cameras, he watched her reaction. "Mr. Rodriguez," she replied, her voice firm. "We really need to discuss what happened. My officers found military-grade equipment hidden around your property. That's not something a simple farmer would have access to." Miguel smiled grimly. She was getting closer to the truth, but she had no idea how deep this went. "Detective, I'm just a farmer who got lucky. Whatever equipment you found must have been left by those men who attacked me. Now please, I need to rest." He watched as she reluctantly returned to her car, knowing this wouldn't be her last attempt, but she was running out of time. The cleaners would arrive soon, and when they did, this quiet neighborhood would become a war zone. Moving back to his command center, Miguel continued his preparations. The previous night's conflict had been carefully controlled, designed to defeat but not kill. The coming battle would be different. The cleaners wouldn't show restraint, and neither could he. His sensors detected more movement, another unmarked vehicle taking up position at the far end of the street. The cleaners were being thorough, establishing a complete surveillance net around his property. They would be watching for patterns, trying to identify weaknesses in his security. Miguel allowed himself a grim smile. Let them watch. Every hour they spent observing was another hour he could use to prepare. The quiet farmer they were surveilling was a fiction, a carefully crafted cover that had already served its purpose. In his chest pocket, he felt the familiar weight of his old Delta Force operator's coin. He hadn't touched it in years, hadn't needed the reminder of who he really was. But now, with professional killers closing in, he found himself running his thumb over its worn surface. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across his property. In less than 24 hours, the cleaners would make their move. They would come with precision, with professional skill, expecting to find a prepared but ultimately outmatched opponent. Instead, they would find something else entirely. A man who had spent his entire life preparing for exactly this type of confrontation. The quiet neighborhood might never be the same, but Miguel had chosen this ground carefully, had spent years turning it into a fortress. As darkness fell, Miguel made his final checks. Every sensor was active, every trap set, every escape route prepared. The cleaners were coming, bringing with them the kind of violence that most people only saw in movies. But Miguel wasn't most people, and this wasn't his first dance with death. Tomorrow night, the cartel would learn the true cost of underestimating the quiet farmer at the edge of development. The cleaners would discover that their target had been waiting for them, preparing for them, ready to show them why some shadows were best left unexplored. In the pre-dawn hours, Miguel's sensors detected the first real movements of the cleaner team, 3 separate groups approaching from different directions, using the darkness for cover. Their heat signatures showed up clearly on his thermal imaging. Professional operators moving with practiced precision through the quiet suburban streets. Right on schedule, Miguel murmured, watching their approach through multiple camera feeds. Their formation was textbook perfect, exactly what he would expect from former Special Forces operators. They were good, very good, but they were operating on his turf, in a battlefield he had spent years preparing. His command center had been transformed over the past 24 hours. Additional screens showed feeds from newly placed cameras, while sophisticated tracking software monitored every movement within a 3-block radius. The cleaners thought they were being stealthy, but to Miguel's enhanced surveillance, they might as well have been marching with floodlights. The first team was approaching from the north, using the cover of a drainage ditch that ran behind several properties. The second team had taken up positions in an abandoned house across the street, one of several properties the cartel had already forced residents to vacate. The third team was moving through the carefully maintained gardens that connected the suburban properties. Miguel watched them set up their positions, noting their professionalism. They had learned from Diego's mistake, taking their time, establishing proper fields of fire. These weren't thugs with guns. These were trained killers who understood the art of tactical warfare. A soft beep from one of his monitors drew his attention. The police band radio was active. Detective Martinez was reporting suspicious activity in the neighborhood. She had noticed something off about the cleaners' movements, despite their careful approach. Miguel had to admire her instincts, even as he hoped she would stay clear of what was coming. "Time to change the game," he whispered, entering a series of commands into his system. Throughout the neighborhood, hidden speakers began emitting subsonic frequencies, not enough to incapacitate, but enough to create subtle disorientation, to make the cleaners question their senses. The effect was almost immediate. Through his thermal imaging, Miguel could see the operators' movements becoming less certain, their coordinated approach beginning to fragment slightly. They wouldn't know what was causing their discomfort, would probably attribute it to pre-mission jitters. One of the cleaners moved too close to a motion sensor, triggering a cascade of responses. Infrared strobes hidden in nearby trees began pulsing at irregular intervals, invisible to the naked eye but playing havoc with their night vision equipment. Miguel watched as they quickly removed their goggles, cursing softly in various languages. The team leader, identifiable by his distinct movement pattern, signaled for his men to hold position. They had realized something was wrong, that this wasn't going to be a simple elimination mission. Through his directional microphones, Miguel could hear fragments of their communications. "Position compromised," one operator whispered into his radio. "Target has countermeasures we didn't anticipate. Request new approach vector." The response from their commander was immediate and harsh. "Maintain position. This ends tonight." Miguel allowed himself a grim smile. They still thought they were in control, that their superior numbers and training would prevail. They hadn't realized yet that every move they made was being watched, analyzed, and countered before they even completed it. He switched his attention to another screen, watching as the team in the abandoned house began setting up their sniper position. They had chosen their spot well. Clear line of sight to his front door, elevated position, good cover. If he had been a normal target, it would have been a perfect kill zone. But Miguel had prepared for this too. With a few keystrokes, he activated the next phase of his defense. Throughout the neighborhood, carefully hidden speakers began playing recorded sounds. Footsteps, whispered conversations, the subtle noises of movement. The sounds were designed to blend with the natural ambient noise, making it impossible to tell what was real and what wasn't. The cleaners' formation tightened as they tried to track the phantom noises. Their professional demeanor was still intact, but Miguel could see the first signs of uncertainty in their movements. They had come expecting to find a prepared but ultimately outmatched opponent. Instead, they were finding themselves drawn into an elaborate trap, their every move anticipated and countered. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Miguel made his final preparations. The cleaners would make their move soon. Professional operators preferred to strike in the gray time between night and day, when human vision was at its weakest. They didn't know that light levels would make no difference in this battle. The quiet suburban neighborhood was about to become a battlefield, unlike anything the cleaners had experienced. Miguel had spent years preparing for this moment, turning his modest property into a fortress that could withstand professional assault. Now it was time to show the cartel's elite kill team exactly what kind of farmer they were dealing with. The first direct engagement came precisely as Miguel had anticipated. The cleaner team in the abandoned house initiated their attack, their sniper taking a carefully aimed shot at what they believed to be his silhouette in the kitchen window. The bullet shattered the glass, but hit only a sophisticated hologram, projected specifically to draw their fire. "Amateur move," Miguel muttered, activating his counter-response. Hidden charges in the abandoned house's foundation detonated, not to destroy, but to destabilize. The floor beneath the sniper team suddenly shifted, throwing off their aim and forcing them to abandon their carefully chosen position. Through his thermal imaging, Miguel watched the chaos unfold. The cleaners were professional enough not to panic, but their coordinated attack plan was already beginning to unravel. The team in the drainage ditch was moving to support their compromised companions, exactly as their training would dictate. That was their second mistake. Miguel triggered the next sequence of defenses. The drainage ditch, which appeared to offer perfect cover for their advance, suddenly filled with a dense, disorienting smoke. It wasn't tear gas or any normal riot control agent. It was a specialized compound designed to interfere with both electronic equipment and human senses. "Command, we're compromised," one of the operators shouted into his radio, his professional calm finally cracking. "Electronic warfare package failing, comms degrading, cannot maintain position." The response from their commander was lost in a burst of static as Miguel's jamming systems kicked into high gear. The third team, still trying to maintain their position in the suburban gardens, suddenly found themselves exposed as hidden lights activated, turning the pre-dawn darkness into artificial day. They were caught in the open, their black tactical gear now making them stand out against the manicured lawns. Miguel watched through his cameras as the cleaners attempted to regroup. They were good, adapting quickly to the changing situation, but they were fighting against an opponent who had prepared for every contingency. Each move they made triggered another carefully planned response. Each attempt to gain advantage turned against them. "Now, for the real surprise," Miguel said, softly, entering a final sequence of commands. Throughout the neighborhood, hidden speakers began broadcasting a carefully constructed audio pattern, not random noise, but specific frequencies designed to interfere with inner ear balance. The effect was subtle but devastating for operators. Trying to maintain precise tactical positioning, the cleaner teams began to stumble, their movements becoming increasingly uncoordinated. Their training was fighting against their own bodies, their senses telling them things that couldn't possibly be true. In their earpieces, their commander was shouting orders, trying to regain control of the situation. But Miguel wasn't finished. As the cleaners struggled to maintain their formation, he activated the next phase of his defense. The ground itself seemed to come alive as hidden mechanical systems created subtle vibrations, further disorienting the already struggling operators. Through his thermal imaging, Miguel could see the cleaner teams starting to break apart. Their professional facade was cracking, replaced by something close to primal fear. They had come expecting to find a prepared target, but this was beyond preparation. This was like fighting against the environment itself. "Target is implementing electronic warfare," one operator reported, his voice strained. "Possible military-grade countermeasures. We need to—" His transmission cut off as another wave of jamming swept through the area. Miguel allowed himself a small smile. The cleaners were learning what Diego's team had discovered, that the quiet farmer they had come to eliminate was something far more dangerous than they had imagined. But unlike the previous night's encounter, this battle would have a different ending. The team leader, still trying to coordinate his scattered forces, made a fatal error. In his attempt to rally his men, he exposed his position just long enough for Miguel's systems to get a precise fix on his location. That was all Miguel needed. With practiced efficiency, Miguel activated his final countermeasure. The ground beneath the team leader's position suddenly gave way, revealing a carefully prepared pit. It wasn't deep enough to kill, but the fall was sufficient to incapacitate, to remove the cleaner's command structure at a crucial moment. The remaining operators, now without leadership and facing an enemy they couldn't effectively fight, began to fall back. Their training was still evident in their movements, but their coordinated assault had devolved into individual survival instincts. This wasn't the quick, professional elimination they had planned. This was a complete tactical failure. Through his multiple camera feeds, Miguel watched as the cleaners retreated, carrying their wounded commander. Their defeat wasn't just physical, it was psychological. They had been beaten not by superior numbers or firepower, but by an environment that seemed to fight against them at every turn. The quiet suburban neighborhood had become their nightmare, every shadow a potential threat, every movement possibly triggering another devastating response. The cartel's elite kill team had just learned a harsh lesson about underestimating their targets, about the danger of assuming that appearances told the whole story. As dawn fully broke over the quiet suburban neighborhood, Miguel watched the last of the cleaner teams disappear into the growing light. Their retreat was professional, coordinated despite their defeat, but the message had been sent. The quiet farmer they had come to eliminate had proven to be far more than they could handle. In his command center, Miguel began systematically shutting down his defensive systems. The sophisticated electronic warfare packages, the hidden speakers, the environmental manipulation systems, all carefully deactivated and concealed once again beneath the peaceful facade of his small farm. A notification flashed on one of his screens. Detective Martinez was approaching the neighborhood, probably responding to reports of suspicious activity. Through his cameras, Miguel could see her car moving slowly down the street, her trained eye taking in details that others might miss. "Time for one last performance," Miguel muttered, quickly changing into his farming clothes. He grabbed a watering can and headed for his garden, emerging just as Martinez's car pulled up to his property. The timing had to be perfect. The confused, elderly farmer tending his plants in the early morning light. "Mr. Rodriguez," Martinez called out, stepping from her car. "We received reports of unusual activity in the area last night. More cartel-related incidents, perhaps?" Her tone was professional, but Miguel could hear the suspicion beneath her words. "Detective," he replied, his voice carrying just the right mix of age and weariness. "I'm afraid I don't know anything about that. After what happened the other night, I've been taking sleeping pills. I sleep quite soundly now." He continued watering his tomatoes, the picture of innocence. Martinez walked closer, her eyes scanning the property. "That's interesting," she said, "because we had multiple reports of strange lights, unusual sounds, and what some described as minor earthquakes, all centered around your property." She paused, watching his reaction. Again, Miguel straightened up slowly, playing up the movements of an aging man. "Detective, look around you. What do you see?" "Just a small farm, some vegetables, an old man trying to find peace in his garden. Whatever happened here, I'm sure it has." A perfectly reasonable explanation. But Martinez wasn't so easily deterred. "Our forensics team found something interesting in the soil samples from the other night. Traces of military-grade compounds, sophisticated electronics embedded in the ground. Care to explain that, Mr. Rodriguez?" "I wouldn't know anything about that," Miguel replied calmly, turning back to his plants. "Perhaps those cartel men brought it with them. They seemed very well equipped." As they spoke, Miguel's hidden sensors detected movement at the edge of his property. The cleaners had left observers behind, professionals tasked with monitoring the situation. They were good, almost invisible to normal detection, but Miguel's systems picked them up easily. Martinez opened her mouth to ask another question, but her radio crackled to life. "Detective, we need you at the station. Multiple reports coming in about last night's incidents." She hesitated, clearly torn between her duty and her suspicions. "You should go, Detective," Miguel said softly. "Sounds important." He continued, tending his plants, the very image of a peaceful farmer with nothing to hide. Martinez gave him one last long look before returning to her car. "This isn't over, Mr. Rodriguez. Whatever is really going on here, I will figure it out." She pulled away, leaving Miguel alone in his garden, or apparently alone. His sensors continued tracking the hidden observers, noting their positions and movements. The cleaners might have retreated, but the cartel wasn't done. They were adapting, learning, preparing for their next move. Miguel allowed himself a small smile as he continued watering his plants. Let them watch, let them study. Let them try to figure out how a simple farmer had defeated their elite kill team. Every hour they spent observing was another hour he could use to prepare for their inevitable return. In his pocket, his secure phone vibrated, a message from his old Delta Force contact. "Cartel chatter suggests they're pulling back, reassessing. You've got them spooked, old friend." Miguel deleted the message immediately, his movements automatic after years of operational security. The morning sun rose higher, casting warm light across his carefully tended gardens. To any observer, it would appear to be just another peaceful day in the suburbs, just a quiet farmer tending his vegetables, going about his simple life. But beneath this tranquil surface, sophisticated systems continued their silent vigilance. Hidden sensors monitored every approach, while automated defenses stood ready. The cartel had learned a costly lesson about underestimating their opponents, but Miguel knew this wasn't over. They would be back with new tactics, new equipment, new plans. But that was fine. Miguel had chosen this quiet neighborhood, this small farm, for very specific reasons. Every attack they launched would only reveal more of his preparations, would only demonstrate further why some targets were best left alone. As he worked in his garden, Miguel's mind was already processing potential scenarios, planning countermeasures, preparing for the next round of this deadly game. The quiet farmer routine might fool some, but the warrior beneath never truly rested. In the secure compound 500 miles away, Carlos Montoya, the regional cartel boss, listened in stunned silence as the cleaner team's commander delivered his report. The man's arm was in a sling, his face still showing signs of their failed operation. "It was like fighting a ghost," the commander explained, his professional demeanor cracking slightly as he recalled the events. "Every move we made was countered before we made it. The target. He wasn't just prepared, he was waiting for us. The entire neighborhood was one giant trap." Montoya leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers drumming thoughtfully on his desk. The quiet farmer had proven to be far more than anyone had anticipated. First Diego's team, now his elite cleaners, both defeated with a precision that spoke of extensive military training. "What's your professional assessment?" Montoya asked, studying the commander's face carefully. "Who are we really dealing with here?" The commander hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "The countermeasures we encountered, they were beyond military grade. The tactical preparation, the psychological warfare aspects, this isn't just some ex-soldier playing farmer. This is someone who operated at the highest levels, special forces, probably Delta or something even more classified." Montoya nodded, slowly, processing this information. The small farm they had targeted for their expansion was turning into a serious problem. The police were asking questions, their normal operations in the area were compromised, and now his best operators had been thoroughly defeated. "Show me everything you have on him," Montoya ordered, turning to his computer. Files began appearing on his screen. Surveillance photos, background checks, property records. Miguel Rodriguez appeared to be nothing more than a simple farmer who had retired to the quiet suburbs, but appearances, as they had learned, could be deceiving. "His cover is perfect," the commander continued. "Every detail holds up to scrutiny. But the way he fights, the way he thinks, this man has seen serious combat, the kind of operations that don't make it into any official records." Montoya's eyes narrowed as he studied a satellite image of the property. From above it looked perfectly ordinary. A small house, well-tended gardens, nothing to suggest it was actually a fortress capable of defeating professional military operators. "What about our observers?" he asked, not looking up from the screen. "The ones you left behind?" The commander's expression darkened. "They report no unusual activity. The target maintains his routine, gardening, basic property maintenance. But," he paused, "they're certain he knows they're there. It's like he's performing for them, playing the role of the simple farmer while letting us know he's aware of our presence." Montoya stood, walking to the window of his office. The situation was escalating beyond his comfort level. The quiet neighborhood he had marked for expansion had become a battleground, and the simple farmer they had tried to intimidate had turned out to be anything but simple. "Sir," the commander spoke up, "my recommendation would be to back off. Find another route for the operation. Whatever this man is, whoever he really is, he's not worth the losses we're taking." But Montoya shook his head slowly. "If we back off now, we show weakness. Other property owners will resist. Our entire operation in the area could collapse." He turned back to face the commander. "No, we need to end this permanently." "With all due respect," the commander replied. "My team won't go back in. Not against him. We're good, but he's operating on another level entirely. That property is a death trap, and he knows every inch of it." Montoya smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Who said anything about your team?" He pressed a button on his desk phone. "Send in Specialized Response Unit Alpha." The commander's face paled slightly. Everyone in the organization knew about Unit Alpha, the cartel's absolute last resort, a team of sociopathic killers who cared nothing for subtlety or survival. They were used only when total destruction was the goal, when the target and everything around it needed to disappear completely. "Sir, in a suburban area, the collateral damage," the commander started, but Montoya cut him off with a wave. "The entire neighborhood is already compromised. Most of the residents have moved out, thanks to our previous efforts. A tragic gas explosion that destroys several houses. Unfortunate, but not unheard of." His voice was cold, calculating. "The farmer, his property, and all evidence of our operations will be eliminated in one strike." The commander stood, recognizing his dismissal. As he reached the door, Montoya spoke again. "One more thing. Have our observer teams pull back. I don't want them caught in what's coming." Left alone in his office, Montoya returned to studying the satellite images of Miguel's property. The quiet farmer had proven to be a formidable opponent, but soon he would learn that some forces couldn't be prepared for, couldn't be defended against. Unit Alpha would turn his carefully prepared fortress into a smoking crater. As he zoomed in on Miguel's garden, Montoya allowed himself a small smile. Let the farmer tend his vegetables, play his role, maintain his deception. In less than 48 hours, it would all be ash anyway. As the evening shadows lengthened, Miguel noticed an unusual pattern in his sensor data. The observer teams that had been maintaining constant surveillance were pulling back, disappearing from their positions, one by one. This wasn't a normal rotation. This was a complete withdrawal. In his command center, Miguel studied the feeds from his long-range surveillance systems. The cartel's presence in the neighborhood, which had been steadily increasing over the past weeks, was suddenly diminishing. Even the routine patrols had ceased. "They're clearing the area," he muttered to himself, his mind already calculating possibilities. His secure phone buzzed. Another message from his intelligence network. The contents made his blood run cold. "Unit Alpha activated, total clearance protocol." Miguel leaned back in his chair, processing this new information. Unit Alpha was the cartel's nuclear option, a team of demolition experts and psychopaths who specialized in complete destruction. They wouldn't try to infiltrate his defenses or engage in tactical warfare. They would simply destroy everything. "So that's how they want to play it," Miguel said softly, reaching for another secure phone. He dialed a number from memory, waiting as it connected through multiple encrypted relays. When it finally connected, he spoke just 2 words: Omega Protocol. The voice that responded was crisp, professional. "Confirmed. Assets are moving. Timeline?" Miguel checked his tactical displays, making rapid calculations. "No more than 48 hours. They'll want to strike before the neighborhood has a chance to repopulate." Moving to another workstation, Miguel began accessing deeper levels of his security system. The defenses he had shown the cleaner team had been impressive, but they were just the surface layer. For Unit Alpha, he would need to activate countermeasures he had hoped never to use. His cameras caught movement at the end of the street, Detective Martinez's car making another patrol. She was still trying to piece together the puzzle, still trying to understand what was really happening in her quiet suburban jurisdiction. Miguel made a quick decision. Accessing a secure terminal, he compiled a data package. Evidence of the cartel's operations, their property seizures, their plans for the area. Everything except his own true identity. He encrypted it and set it to automatically send to Martinez's office in 24 hours. "Sorry, detective," he murmured, "but you need to stay clear of what's coming." He knew the information would keep her busy, would hopefully keep her focused on the bigger picture rather than his small farm. A warning light flashed on one of his monitors. Long-range sensors detecting vehicles moving toward the neighborhood. Not Unit Alpha, not yet, but advanced teams setting up blocking positions. They would isolate the area, ensure that no one could interfere with what was coming. Miguel stood, stretching muscles that had grown tense during hours of monitoring. He moved to a hidden wall panel, pressing his palm against what appeared to be solid concrete. With a soft hiss, the panel slid aside, revealing a small armory. The weapons inside weren't the standard military gear he had used against Diego's team, or even the sophisticated countermeasures that had defeated the cleaners. These were specialized tools, designed for dealing with opponents who had abandoned all pretense of surgical precision. As he began checking and preparing the equipment, Miguel's mind wandered to his years in Delta Force. He had seen Unit Alpha's handiwork before, had studied their tactics and methodologies. They were brutal, efficient, and utterly without conscience. His security systems registered another change in the neighborhood. The last of the remaining residents were leaving, responding to subtle pressures and unexplained warnings. Soon, the entire area would be empty, except for Miguel and his carefully prepared property. A message flashed across one of his screens, confirmation that his own reinforcements were in position. Unlike the cartel's observers, these operators were truly invisible, ghosts who had learned their craft in the same shadows where Miguel had earned his skills. "Let them come," Miguel said softly, returning to his command center. Unit Alpha thought they were coming to destroy a prepared position, to obliterate a stubborn farmer who had caused their organization too much trouble. Instead, they were walking into a confrontation with an opponent who had spent decades preparing for exactly this type of escalation. The quiet neighborhood had become a stage, set for a final act that would demonstrate why some targets, no matter how seemingly vulnerable, should never be engaged. Miguel's small farm wasn't just a fortress, it was a trap designed specifically for men like Unit Alpha, men who thought that overwhelming force was always the answer. As night fell, Miguel made his final preparations. The cartel had chosen to escalate beyond intimidation, beyond professional elimination, to total destruction. In doing so, they had opened a door that couldn't be closed, had initiated a sequence of events that would change everything. The simple farmer's routine was over. The pretense of normalcy had served its purpose. Now, it was time for Miguel Rodriguez to show the cartel exactly who they had chosen to target, why some quiet men were best left to tend their gardens in peace. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.